thank you all for joining. I'm sure there are many other places you would want to be right now, but you chose to be here. And say many other places you could be, at least many other places you would want to be. So the topic is the holiday of freedom while in quarantine, which is a pretty depressing thought, but seems to be becoming a more and more obvious reality for lots of us this coming Passover. Whether it's forced isolation or recommended isolation or just self-isolation because that's the best way to protect the people around us. That definitely seems to be the direction that lots of us are going. I think if we look a little bit deeper into the meaning of Pesach, of Passover, it'll actually, what seems to be something that just can't work with the Seder will actually seem like an opportunity. So that's what I want to discuss. Hopefully we'll get a deeper meaning into what Passover is all about and then be able to apply it this year, whether we're going to be alone or not. It's an important message no matter what your Pesach plans are looking like right now. So just to start off, I'd like to share here, story of Passover. So let's just do a quick rundown of what happened behind Passover, and then hopefully we'll use that as springboard for getting a better understanding into Passover itself. So the story starts off in 1522 BCE. The Jewish people settle in Egypt and begin multiplying and integrating. Can everyone see the page? Even if you can't.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So the Egyptians see that the Jews are becoming so prosperous and multiplying, and they're worried that they're going to join with future enemies in taking over the country. Why would the Jews do that? For no reason whatsoever. It's called Anti-Semitism. The Jews are always looked at as the other and as some sort of scary entity that's going to somehow take over and I don't know what. So this is the first example of that. So the Egyptians slowly begin enslaving the Jewish people and then shift actually to attempting genocide. So then God sends Moses to Pharaoh, warning him that he must free the Jewish people or the Egyptians will suffer plagues. Pharaoh repeatedly ignores the warnings and denies God's ability and his will to interfere with nature on behalf of the Jewish people. He says, there's no way God can do anything. It's fine. Don't worry. God then inflicts 10 plagues upon Egypt. Each one of these plagues expressing God's control over all aspects of nature, beginning with the water and the land and ending with darkness and human life. So God is not just trying to take the Jews out of Egypt. He could have done that in a second. He's going through a process of teaching mainly the Jewish people, but also the Egyptians, that he is in control of everything. And this is basically like God introducing himself to the Jewish people. The Egyptians finally get the message and beg the Jews to leave immediately. The Jews leave so hurriedly that their bread doesn't have a chance to rise. So they're left with unleavened bread. They leave. This happens in 1312 BCE. A few days later, the Egyptians change their mind and chase the Jews to try to get them back. The Jews find themselves cornered by the Reed Sea, so they pray to God for help. God performs an open miracle by splitting the sea, and the Jews pass through. And then, final part of the story, the Egyptians try to follow, but the water comes crashing down on them, and the Jewish people are saved, and they are free. So this is basically the story of Passover, of Pesach, in a nutshell. So if it was your job to give this holiday a name, what name would you suggest for the holiday? We just saw the basic story. What could we call this holiday? Let's name it.
Passover.
So one suggestion was Passover. Any other suggestions?
Enslaved.
Pesach.
Enslaved?
Yeah.
I'll try to think of something actually creative.
Freedom.
So Pesach, freedom. I love it. Freedom. I mean, it's cheating if you saw the title of the class, but I still respect it. Nathan, that was great. So Passover, enslaved, freedom, great suggestions. So Passover is an official name for the holiday, and by enslaved, I think you meant like just talking about being enslaved and then freed, so it's all part of that same name of freedom. And that also is a name that the holiday is given in the Torah. What's shocking is that the primary name given in the Torah is holiday of matzahs. How random is that? Holiday of matzahs. So let's go back to the story. Can you see when I'm scrolling? Hi, Gennady.
Yeah.
So we had the whole story, and then there was like one sideline right here where as the Jews are leaving, they grab bread, but the bread doesn't have a chance to rise, so left with unleavened bread. So it's called the holiday of unleavened bread. So can you imagine if they grabbed energy bars? Would we call it the holiday of energy bars? 1 second, I don't know why it's bouncing all around, right? So why, of all these names, I would call it Passover, right? Because that was the, what?
Or if they grab toilet paper, God forbid.
Yeah, exactly, right? So is that what you would call it? So I would call it holiday of Passover, maybe because that's the climax of the miracles where God is showing himself to the world, and he passes over the Jewish homes. He shows how he knows what's going on behind closed doors. He knows everything that's going on. He's in total control over life. So that's Passover. Freedom is basically the theme of the entire thing, where we start off being totally enslaved, and then slowly God reveals himself and takes us out, and then we're free, right? That's like the common theme of the holiday of freedom. Instead, the Torah prefers to focus on the fact that we grabbed granola bars as we were running out, right? So why is that what the Torah decides to focus on? It seems like such a trivial part, definitely not part of the theme. Why would the Torah focus on that? So that's the question that hopefully we'll get more clarity as we go through this class. So let's go back to the second most popular name for the holiday, which is the holiday of freedom. The Torah calls it that also, but it's funny because there's actually more than one way to say freedom in Hebrew, and there are no synonyms in Hebrew. There's no such thing as a synonym in classical Hebrew. So if there's more than one word to say something, it means they each have a different meaning, and there's an important difference between those different meanings. So in order to get a better understanding of what a holiday is all about, we'd have to figure out which word we're using for freedom, try to get the exact definition, and then apply it to the holiday. So in modern Hebrew, the most commonly used word for freedom is chofesh, exactly. So I have it here in small in parentheses.
There is also cherut. Oh yeah, cherut.
Right. So cherut is also true, but the most common one is chofesh in modern Hebrew, and that is actually barely ever appears in the Torah and has a very, very specific meaning that doesn't really apply in general. So it's actually a mistake that we use that in modern Hebrew. So the two common words are dror, right here, drawer, and cherut, right? So those are the two common words that are used for freedom in Hebrew. So the way to get a better understanding of what those words means is to go back to the sources that you guys saw earlier, even though you weren't supposed to be looking at them, and see when the Torah brings each one of those words in what context and get a better understanding of them. So now I will go right back to sharing the proper one. Just a moment. I want to make sure I don't make the same mistake again. Okay, let's try this again. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Awesome. Perfect. So the first source is source A in Leviticus 25:10. And the background for that source is that in general, the Torah believes in a pretty free market, but there are certain clauses and conditions. And one of them is the one we're about to read about. It's that once every 50 years, there was a restart button to the economy. So if someone had a certain property that was a family property that had been passed down from generation to generation, and then this person ran out of money and needed to quickly sell his property. So the maximum amount of time he can sell the property for is up to 50 years, after which the economy hits restart and that property goes back to him. So if it's 10 years before that 50-year line, so it's a cycle of 50 years. It's not based on 50 years from when you sold it. You could sell it at the beginning of the cycle and then you'd be selling it for 49 or 50 years. Or if you sell it towards the end, you would get less money for the property, but 10 years later or 5 years later, depending on the year, the property jumps right back to you and you get it back. So the Torah says, you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim freedom. Here we see freedom throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be the Jubilee year for you shall return each man to his ancestral heritage, and you shall return each man to his family. So the ancestral heritage is that piece of land that he had that someone else now came in and bought it, so now he gets to go back. So in Hebrew, the word is in bold. V'kidashtem et shnat hachamishim shana ukratem. You should proclaim. The word for freedom is drawer. That's that first one that we saw earlier. That first type of drawer. So every word in classical Hebrew has a root. And generally speaking, it's a 3-letter root. Sometimes there's a 2-letter root. This is an example of a 2-letter root. So anyone familiar with the word for an apartment in Hebrew?
Dira.
Nice, dira. So this is the same root as dira, right? To an apartment, somewhere you live, but it's drawer. So let's see Rashi explaining what this means. Said Rabbi Yehuda, this is source B. Said Rabbi Yehuda, what does the term drawer mean? As one who dwells in a dwelling, who dwells wherever he wishes and is not under the domain of others. Thus the term drawer denotes freedom. So it's a type of freedom that means you can be wherever you want, you can live wherever you want. You have the freedom basically to just do whatever you want. That's one type of freedom, okay? Right? You're not limited to a specific place, and you know you're not bound by anything. You can do whatever you want. So now let's take a look at source C and see the other type of freedom. So the background for source C is Moses is coming down from Mount Sinai with the tablets, and he's about to give the Torah on these tablets to the Jewish people, and the Torah pauses to describe how the Torah was written how the 10 Commandments were written on these tablets. So it says, source C, the tablets were God's handiwork, and the script was the script of God engraved on the tablets. So that's funny. We're looking for a word for freedom. This is not actually talking about freedom. It's talking about engraved. So if you look in the Hebrew, it says v'haluchot ma'aseh Elokim hema v'amichtav michtav Elokim hu. That's basically what we just read in English. But the word engraved is charut al haluchot. A ches, a resh, a vav, and a taf. So that is the same spelling as the word freedom we saw earlier, but here it actually means engraved. So what is going on? Is it freedom? Is it engraved? What's with this word? It's a funny word. So it's interesting. The word engraved classically is spelled differently than this. So in general, when we spell the word, here we have a chet, a resh, a vav, and a taf. In general, the way we spell engraved would be a chet, a resh, a vav, and a tet. So why is it spelled here with a taf? So let's take a look at Rashi. If there's anything that you might be able to ask on the way a verse is written, Rashi is there for you. He'll always pick up in it and he'll ask it, or at least just answer, just make a statement that's really coming to answer that question. So preempts your question. So let's look at Rashi, source D. The word cheret with the letter tet and the word cheret with the letter taf are related. So Rashi is basically saying, relax. It's okay. I know you're all concerned why I didn't say it with a tet. Let me tell you, it's not the end of the world, because even if it has a taf, it still has the same meaning. So
Why?
Just in the Hebrew language, I mean, it's a good question. Why, right? And it's related to the fact that the letters sound the same. So if letters are making the same sound, obviously in their root, there's a connection between them, spiritually speaking. So it cannot be that two words will sound exactly the same. Just like you can't have two different words with the same exact meaning. You can't have two words that sound the same but actually have nothing to do with each other. There has to be a connection if they sound the same. So Rashi is telling you, relax. Even with a tough, we haven't lost the meaning of had it been written with a tet. So if you were reading that Rashi and you weren't in a good mood, what would you ask?
Obviously, it's related, but I'm trying to get to why is it a different letter?
Yes, exactly. So Rashi's saying, don't worry. Thank you. Rashi's saying, don't worry. Even with a tough, we can. It still kind of means the same thing. So don't freak out on me. So we should ask, okay, thank you, Rashi. So why didn't the Torah just use a tet, and then, Rashi could do something? It's not like the Torah is worried about Rashi going out of business, so he needs to keep him busy, right? So just write it with a tet, and then we won't need Rashi, and we'll be able to just read the verse and go on to the next verse, right? Is that a good question? I think so. Thank you, Isaac. So let's look at source E. This question is actually a question that the Mishnah in Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, is bothered by. And the Mishnah reads as follows. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, the verse states, the tablets were God's handiwork, and the script was the script of God engraved on the tablets. So it says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, do not read it as engraved, charut, rather read it as cherut, freedom. So because the way the Torah chose to spell it is the same spelling as the word freedom, the Torah wants to hint to the meaning of freedom. For there is no one as free as one who engages in Torah study. So that's a funny statement. There is no one as free as someone who decides to sit in front of a table and read old, ancient texts. So, that's not my vision of someone who's free, is someone who isn't locked up in his house for Passover. He's actually at a beach in Florida getting a suntan. That's what I would call free. But the Mishnah here says there's no one as free in the meaning of cherut, spelled chet reish vav taf, as someone who engages in Torah study. So this is something that needs understanding. But before we understanding why the Mishnah gives this extreme statement, let's try to understand how we could have a word for engraving and a word for freedom, and the two words will be so closely related. How can engraving be related to freedom? And the answer is basically, I'll bring two examples. First of all, I have a brother who's a medic, and he runs around saving lives, and that's especially important right now because, the outbreak in Israel is pretty bad, and he got training to put on the full hazmat suit. He actually looks really good in it, and he, goes places, risks his own life to save people. And it's really an amazing thing. And, that should be an inspiration for me. And I should also say, you know what? I will also become a medic. And I really can. There's no one stopping me from becoming a medic myself. There is a slight technical issue, and that is that if I see blood, I keel over and faint. So perhaps one could argue that there are other professions that are better for me, like sitting in front of a computer doing a Zoom class, right? Much more simple, straightforward, less chances of me ending up on the floor passed out. But on the other hand, I am totally free to decide to pursue whatever career I choose. There's no one stopping me. But if I want to free myself from things that are pulling me in the wrong direction, things that are not going to end up working out too well, I'll just be the type of medic who shows up on the scene, and then the medics have to actually turn their attention away from the original patient and give me attention instead. So if I want to actually achieve my true potential, there are certain options that I need to limit out in order to focus on options that are more suited for me and will actually allow me to achieve my full potential. Another example, when we, thank God, we live in a house, because if we were stuck in an apartment with my kids who, thank God, are blessed with lots and lots of energy, I'm not sure it would have ended up too well for at least for my own personal sanity. But when we came to move into this house, we first went around with an inspector, and the inspector said, "Oh, I think there's something I should let you know." And that is that, it's very good. Your house has foundations and there's a pillar that your house is sitting on. There's a slight technical issue, and that is that there is a space between the pillar and the actual house. So your house is basically floating in midair. So, you can choose whether you want to move in or not. So we're like, okay, forget it. Who wants to live in a floating house? What if it gets windy in the windy city? So we said, actually, it's not such a big problem. All you need is something that's like 2 inches thick, or maybe even 1 inch thick. You just stick it in between the house and the pillar, and you're fine. It's like really not such a big deal. So if you try to think of something that is about 1 inch or 1.5 inches thick and is flat, and you can just stick it in. So right now I'm doing the Zoom class with my MacBook. So that's a perfect size, and I could just stick it right in there and it'll work fine. And there's really, and that would be actually perfect. We'd be able to move into the house. The only thing is that you could do the same thing with any piece of wood. And in order to get the true potential from my MacBook, it would be best to use my MacBook the way you can actually use it, and like better than just regular pieces of plastic and metal. So if you rule out different options that aren't helping my MacBook achieve its true potential, you are freeing the MacBook from distractions and allowing it to actually pursue its full potential. So that is how the word freedom and the word engraving can come together. It's because you're cutting out all the bad options that are really, really bad choices, and you're allowing yourself to focus on the best options for you. So now let's take a look at source F. This is a Talmud Bavli in Tractate Barachot. Rabbi Alexander, after he prayed, would say the following: Master of the universe, it is known and revealed before you that it is our will to do your will. So he's saying, listen, I want you to know we're not perfect. We make mistakes. But I want you to know we really mean to do the right thing. Who prevents us? Right? God, why are we sometimes not doing the right thing? I have an excuse. Who prevents us? Listen to this. The yeast in the dough. The yeast in the dough really? Really? That is what's preventing you from doing the right thing? That's what he says. The yeast in the dough and the subjugation to the non-Jewish nations. So if we have a ruler who tells us that we cannot study Torah, that prevents us from doing the right thing, right? So that's a pretty good excuse, right? If there's like an evil king who's ruling us and says you cannot do the mitzvah of keeping Shabbat, so that is something that's preventing us from doing the right thing. But the first excuse is a little bit of a stretch. The yeast in the dough, what's he talking about? What's he referring to, right? So that is I think a pretty good question. So take a look at source G, and then hopefully this will help us wrap things up. This is talking about, this is from the book of Genesis, when God creates the animals. And it says, now Hashem God had formed, that's in bold, formed out of the ground every beast of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to man to see what he would call each one. So look at the word formed in Hebrew. Vayitzer. It's like creating, forming. Okay, now let's look at the description for the creation of man. That's source H. It's a few verses later. And Hashem, God, formed the man of dirt from the ground, and he blew into his nostrils the soul of life. Okay, so we have forming of an animal, of the animal kingdom, and forming of man. So now take a look in the Hebrew. The word forming is the word in bold, and see if you can find a difference between the two words, which should be basically the same, just forming and forming. Anyone spot any differences in the word in bold here and here?
2 yuds.
Nice. 2 yuds. So why, and it's basically the same meaning, but why did the Torah add an extra yud in the forming of man? So Talmud Bavli, Tractate Barachot discusses this. This is source I. Rabbi Nachman bar Rabbi Chisda expounded, what is meant by the text? Then the Lord God formed Vayitzer man. The word Vayitzer is written with two yuds to show that God created two inclinations, one good and the other evil. So the letter yud represents a spiritual force. And in animals, there's only one spiritual force that moves them. This is what we call the nefesh. That's a spiritual source that keeps it alive, that tells it to eat, to propagate, to take care of itself. That's its spiritual force. But in humans, there's a duality, and there are two separate spiritual forces inside a human being when the human being was created. What are these two separate forces? It is the word Vayetzer is written with two yuds to show that God created two inclinations, one good and the other evil. So this is coming to represent the fact that God created in man two separate spiritual forces that are pulling man in two separate directions. So if you have your alarm clock goes off and it's time to get up, and this is going back to days where you actually had to get up and go to work. So your alarm clock goes off and you're like, okay, I have an opportunity to get up and do great things in the world, be productive. So then you just get up right away and go to work. Except that often that's not how it plays out. Often there's another little voice that says, one second, you want to be productive. You have to make sure that you're rested before you go to work. So you have to hit the snooze button, roll over, and be able to actually approach the day in a proper way. So don't do anything too quickly. Just hit the snooze button and everything will be fine. And that is actually the force that's pulling you towards laziness, towards inertia. It doesn't want you to jump out of bed, and it'll come up with all these excuses. It's not some sort of external thing. It's that part of you within you that wants to kind of stay put and not be as productive as you can. And that's true about productivity. It's true about making the right choices. If you're trying to diet and you have a whole plan on how you're going to be so healthy, and then that chocolate is looking at you, and then that's often when that other voice becomes the loudest voice. And you can barely hear that pure little squeak of your good inclination telling you, no, don't do it. All you can hear is chocolate. So those are the two forces within the person. And that is what's represented here by the extra yud. So what's this? So this Yetzer Hara, this so-called evil inclination, basically what it tells you is stay put, don't do anything too fast. It tries to make things that are not so significant look really, really significant and big. It tries to puff up your own ego. That's basically what it tries to do. So let's look at the Ramchal discussing this. This is in his book Derech Hashem. The Ramchal is Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who lived in Italy between 1707 and 1747. And I know that off by heart because I'm reading it right here. So the Ramchal says, the highest wisdom decreed that man should consist of two opposites. These are his pure spiritual soul and his unenlightened physical body. So your body is that's what represents that part of you that tries to just pull you towards materialism and not achieving greatness. Each one is drawn towards its nature. So that the body inclines towards the material, while the soul leans towards the spiritual. The two are then in a constant state of battle. So if you try to find did someone ask something? Oh no, imagine that. So if you try to pick a metaphor for that evil inclination, think inertia, right? Not moving any too quickly. Think blowing up beyond actual proportions. Really something that's really of a small amount of actual substance looking much bigger than actually is. And I think a perfect metaphor for that is dough. So you take a little bit of flour, a little bit of water, and you don't do anything too quickly. Kind of let it sit around, no sudden moves. And then slowly this little bit of substance becomes this whole big, beautiful thing that looks much bigger than it actually is. And that is a metaphor for what our so-called evil inclination, the more materialistic side of us, that's how it behaves. So it takes something with very little substance. It makes it look much better. It is. It's pulling towards inertia, not doing anything too quickly. So let's take a look at the final source. This is Rashi on that original prayer that we saw earlier in Brachot, in source F, in Brachot, source 17a. So he said, what's preventing me from doing the right thing? The yeast in the dough. Says Rashi, the yeast in the dough. This symbolizes the Yetzer Hara, the drive to do evil. So we suddenly realize this gives a whole new light to what the festival of Passover is all about. So we called it we said really the name that we should give the festival of Passover is the holiday of freedom. That should be the main name. Why would the Torah focus on something that seems so irrelevant like the matzah? What we're seeing now is that there's actually a deep connection between freedom and matzah, especially since the Torah never says Chag HaChofesh, and the Torah never says Chag HaDror. Those were the two first types of freedom, right? The freedom in modern Hebrew of Chofesh, which has a very specific connotation regarding specific laws, but it only appears once in the Torah. And then the freedom of Dror, which means you can do whatever you want. When we hear freedom, that's the most standard type of freedom. You can live wherever you want, do whatever you want. You're free to go wherever you want. That's the freedom at the beach in Florida. But the freedom that the Torah calls the holiday of Passover is Chag HaCherut, the freedom of the holiday of engraved freedom, which means the freedom of ruling out things that are pulling us in the wrong direction and focusing only on our true and best potential. And that is why the Torah calls it Chag HaMatzot, the holiday of matzah, the holiday of unleavened bread, because that is the holiday. The unleavened bread is the bread without that metaphor for our more basic materialistic drives that pull us in the wrong direction. If we only listen to that part of us that wants inertia, and that part of us that doesn't want us to reach our true potentials and do great things, then we will feel free, right? But we're actually kind of enslaved to our careers, enslaved to our Netflix accounts. We're enslaved to lots of different things. We feel like, oh my gosh, we get to choose, but we're constantly being pulled into choosing the wrong types of choices. And that is not actually true freedom. I read a statistic once about the amount of, I don't remember the actual statistic because I saw it a year ago, but it was the percentage of people who get freed from jail and then end up back in jail within the next few months. So it seems like there's no one more free than someone who gets released from jail. But if the person who gets released from jail is going, statistically speaking, is very likely to end up back in jail because of regression and making bad choices again. So obviously he wasn't actually free when he was released from jail. There were still psychological things that were enslaving him. But there was this superficial freedom, this drawer. He was allowed to live wherever he wanted, do whatever he wanted, and he was also allowed psychologically to make lots and lots of bad choices, and he was constrained from making good choices, and he never actually had true freedom. So that gives us a whole new look on this holiday of freedom. And yes, it's depressing to think about being stuck at home for this holiday, but there are many silver linings about the fact that we're stuck at home, because we've had this period of reflection kind of forced upon us where we're not constantly distracted by our jobs and our careers and whatever it is. Everything hit pause. The entire world hit pause. And yes, we might have very little drawer, which drawer is great. You need to have a nice amount of drawer, but this Passover might have very little drawer to live where we want and go wherever we want. We might be kind of stuck in our homes, but hopefully we can utilize this Passover to achieve the even higher level of freedom, which is freedom of the soul, freedom of the spirit, and freedom to make only great and awesome choices. And hopefully we'll be able to then go back the following Passover a year from now and have both of those awesome things, freedom of cherut and freedom of dror, and be able to combine them in the best way possible. So there will be more classes on help with actually conducting your own Seder if you're forced into making your own Seder. And it's a pretty rare opportunity for people to make their own Seder, but it's not complicated, it's doable, and hopefully we'll be able to make lemonade out of lemons. That's it for today. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Any questions? No pressure.
So this is just one thing when you were mentioning about why would the Torah refer to it as like Chag HaMatzot specifically. The first answer that came to my mind was that we have a mitzvah also to feel like we were slaves in Egypt that were liberated by Hashem in Pesach. And if you think about it contextually and practically, we're not going to go back to Egypt and slave ourselves and then go out to really feel, oh, this is what freedom looks like now. But really, matzah is the only physical item that we can use to feel, in a sense, the journey, to empathize in a sense that we can't eat the bread we're used to and we love. And I'm sorry, in my case, I'm stuck with matzah. But I was looking at it from that perspective.
Very nice. Great. That works. Just another thought about Seder not looking the way we expect a Seder to look, because a Seder is, in our mind, it's like, how can you ever have Passover without being with family or being at a big table with lots of other people? But it's very good to remember that Pesach was never meant to be this just round circle of repeating the same thing every single year. And every year is supposed to be different. And our job is just to make the best out of every situation that we're in. So for instance, I had a rabbi in yeshiva, we were talking about this actually with Matt and Isaac, and a rabbi in yeshiva who said, imagine the following scenario. It's Yom Kippur, and you find yourself locked in a bathroom the entire day, just stuck in a bathroom. So you think, oh my gosh, I missed out on Yom Kippur. I didn't have Yom Kippur this year. Yom Kippur is all about being in the synagogue and praying and fasting, and I never had that Yom Kippur. But what do you think? God wanted you to be in the synagogue? If God wanted you to be in the synagogue, you wouldn't be locked in a bathroom. Your job is to see the situation that you're in and make the best out of it. And the best Yom Kippur you can have is whatever you manage to do with that situation. But constantly thinking about, oh no, really Yom Kippur should be a different situation, that's just silly, because were you meant to be in that situation, you would be. And your job is just, like we said, to make a nice sweet drink from whatever fruit you have. And if what you have is lemons, then make awesome lemonade. So it's like it's easier said than done. But it's really, I think, the most important mindset for this Pesach is, like, yes, in my mind, the Seder always looked differently than it looks right now with me by myself in my house. But let's see how I can take this situation and make it awesome. And this is how this 2020 Seder is supposed to look like. So that's just a thought that at least works for me and hopefully will work for other people. Okay, any other thoughts, comments, stories, questions, jokes? Okay, thank you all for joining, and take care, and I hope you have an awesome Seder, and we'll be back for actual practical advice and tips for running your own Seder. So take care, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you.